Question number 12, Hon Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Defence. Does he stand by his statement this morning that comments about sending troops to Iraq being the price of being part of the club were quote-unquote unfortunate?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, the comment that the questioner refers to was from a Radio New Zealand interview this morning. The topic of the interview was related to the possible contribution New Zealand might make to the fight against Daesh or ISIL, and I made it clear that my comment referred to comments made by the British Foreign Secretary. Clearly confusing club for family. I stand by my comments.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
When this morning on radio he described his leader, the Prime Minister's comments, as being unfortunate, was that because currying favour with other club members is a poor reason to give for putting the lives of New Zealand soldiers at risk?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, as I've just said, that wasn't my intention. I misunderstood the intent of the question from the radio interviewer, and I confused two things, club and family. I stand by my comment, meant to be that the British Foreign Secretary's comment last week saying that we were part of the family and expected to turn up was inappropriate.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, if it's not for reason of being part of the club, what is the justification for putting Kiwi soldiers in harm's way to train the Iraqi army when 10 years and $25 billion worth of efforts by the United States to train that army has failed to end the incompetence, the poor leadership and the corruption of that army?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr. Speaker, for a start, there has been no decision to do any of the things that Mr. Goff is suggesting. We've been very open with the public that we are looking at how we might contribute to the fight against ISIL, and if anybody wonders why we're even looking at it, they only have to look at events in Sydney this morning.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary
Speaker.
question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Why do human rights abuses by ISIS apparently require our military intervention when years of similarly appalling abuses by Boko Haram and by President al-Assad of Syria have attracted so little comment and no action from his government?
Mr. Speaker, the first point would be that this government does condemn those atrocities committed by the people that the Minister lists. There's no question about that. But when there is an opportunity to do something, as there may be, as we conduct our investigations, then that becomes a point where you do something about nipping in the bud the very organisation that appears to be funding a lot of these other ratbags around the world.
A supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary question, Honourable Phil Goff.
Why was he pretending yesterday that contingency training for an Iraq deployment was about to begin when his own office admitted more than 2 months ago on the 2nd of December that contingency training for deployment was already underway?
Mr. Speaker, that is the popular interpretation Mr. Goff likes to put on things. What happened before Christmas, I'm informed, is that CDF did say he wanted some people trained for a general mission to the Middle East. We've made it specific that they should train for Iraq. New Zealand troops are very good at training and becoming familiar with the culture that they are going to be entering into, and that's why they have such a good reputation around the world. It is appropriate that they make some preparations, but I stress again, no decision has been made. The information we need to make that decision is not available at this point.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, I seek to table a quote from the Minister's own office by his spokesman saying that contingency had already started for Iraq on the 2nd of December.
Order. It's effectively a press release the members are seeking to...
It would have been quoted in the media, sir. I probably got it from the Parliamentary Library.
I'm not prepared to put the lead. Point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Unlike a previous Minister of Defence, I'm not led by the nose by staff of my office.
And that is not a point of order. Order. That concludes questions for oral answer. I have received a letter from the Right Honourable Winston Peters